Well, good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this regular meeting of April the 28th, 2021. And I would like to call the meeting to order officially. And I would ask Derek if he will continue to play the national anthem, please. Director Sliwa, would you take roll call, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening, everybody. This is our roll call for our regular board meeting of April 28th, 2021. Trustee Barry.
Present.
Thank you. Trustee Cram. Trustee Danner.
Trustee Danner, present.
Thank you. And I heard Trustee Cram as well, so thank you, Mr.
Yes,
Cram.
you did. Thank you. I was slow on the uptake.
Trustee Jacobs. Vice Chair McPherson.
Present.
Thank you. Chair McAllister.
Present.
Trustee McRae.
Present.
Thank you. Trustee McDonald.
Present.
Thank you. Trustee Parisian.
Present.
Thank you. Trustee Schooler.
Present.
Thank you. Trustee Swan.
Present.
Thank you. Trustee Evans. Trustee Hughes. Mr. Chair, you have quorum this evening.
Thank you, Director. I have a motion moved by Trustee Barry, seconded by Trustee Cram, that the Upper Canada District School Board approve consent agenda items 502 to 503, April 28th, 2021, as submitted. Please cast your ballot online.
Mr. Chair, that motion carries.
Thank you, Ms. Workman. Are there any conflict of interest declarations? Hearing none, we will move to Article 801. Director Sliwa, would you have any comments this evening?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good evening again, trustees. Yes, several things to share with the board this evening. The board would certainly be interested knowing that they are a student first and child first organization, knowing that the Ministry of Education, Mr. Chair, is embarking on an anti-human trafficking strategy. This is obviously very important for many reasons, including the exploitation of young and vulnerable people. And the ministerial strategy right now is based on awareness, then identifying young people who may be at risk of that kind of exploitation and providing those children and their families with some support. One of the important developments that's come out of there, Mr. Chair, as you know, is that locally we've had a focus on a working group by Mayor Robin Jones from Westport about 2 or 3 years ago, invested in this kind of strategy locally and raising it to a level of dialogue around what communities can do as part of anti-human trafficking. And so I do think that the Upper Canada region is well situated to engage in this dialogue. And we can expect that there'll be more details to come from the Ministry of Education regarding the awareness campaign, how it will be built into teaching and learning in schools, and how we can support students. As well, Mr. Chair, obviously top of mind for staff and for the board as well is, given the pandemic, the vaccination of staff. The Minister of Education has made it clear, I know that during your phone calls, Mr. Chair, as part of weekly briefings with chairs from boards of education, and with the Deputy Minister with weekly briefings with directors of education, that the vaccination of staff is critical to maintaining the strategy of keeping schools open and keeping educators safe in order to discharge their duties of serving children and supporting schools. The Ministry of Education, as you know, Mr. Chair, has provided guidance on how that would approach or be approached. And at this juncture, we have about 738 staff who qualified under the criteria provided by the Ministry of Education to pursue vaccinations as part of the education sector's first round. More to come, of course, and certainly educators and all of us in the community know that vaccinations is key to improve community wellness and for the wellness of everyone at work and at home. More details to come, Mr. Chair, when the board receive its monthly update next month with regards to vaccination and screening and where things are at in terms of the Upper Canada District School Board. As well, Mr. Chair, there has been active focus on staffing for the next school year. It's hard to believe that people are already having to plan and orient themselves for that, but we've been invested in the process since mid-March, and we continue to move forward. That also includes focusing on administrator assignments, so that's appointments and transfers. And so we'll be informing the board in the very near future, within the next 2 weeks, about those changes, knowing that trustees and the community at large are interested about who's in charge at their schools at the principal and vice principal level. And then lastly, Mr. Chair, the work of the senior team right now is about understanding the details for the next 8 to 10 weeks in this current operational year. And of course, our principals, vice principals, and managers would also like to understand what's on the horizon for how we'll be operating schools and delivering programs to students. We've been assured, and I know you've received the same assurances, Mr. Chair, in your weekly conference calls with the Ministry of Education, that there is every intention to provide that guidance about school operations for the remainder of this school year in the very near future. And of course, we'll be welcoming that information, because that will give clarity and a clear view about how we should be proceeding until the end of June. So, Mr. Chair, I'll turn that back over to you and see if there's any questions from you or from the trustees.
Trustees, do you have any questions? Hearing none, and I'm sure that
if I may, Mr. Chair, is there any word on when the CNA grants for student needs will be known? I'll mute myself.
I think I can answer that if I could, Trustee Barry, and I was going to address that. We keep pressing, I keep pressing almost weekly with the minister for the rapid announcement of the GSNs, because it is important to us. I mean, it's really important to us. And the answer I get all the time is that next week or it's imminent. So I think we're going to hear very shortly. Anybody
Thank you.
else? Anyone else? If not, thank you, Director. We're going to move to 10:01, which is the special recognition and farewell wishes to Stephen Sliwa, our Director of Education. And I just want to, I just have a few comments here. Well, a few comments, I'm sorry, with regard to 9:01. With regard to the rumored extension of fully remote learning as a choice for families and students, I just want to inform trustees that motions 1 and 2 from last meeting have been addressed, and work is progressing on my conversations with the wardens and the president of Roma, and Mayor Robin Jones of Westport. In my participation in the weekly teleconferences with the minister, I keep pressing for clarity regarding the GSNs, the reopening of schools, and a post-pandemic plan or pathway to the future for September. And the minister assures me that hope is on the way. And finally, this present lockdown, while necessary, continues to be a huge challenge for families, students, our teachers, our educators in our schools. And I wish to recognize their monumental effort. Know that our family in the Upper Canada District School Board is supporting you as much as possible. So I was ahead of myself there, but I'm going to move to 10:01, which is the recognition and farewell wishes to Director Sliwa. Last Thursday evening, we had a wonderful evening of celebration, and the last board meeting on April the 7th was to have been Stephen's final meeting, but he felt he had some unfinished business on the Kemptville campus file, and given our honored guests later in the agenda, he wanted to be present. And so thank you, Director, for that. And so, Director, this is your final board meeting, and this is indeed a time for many lasts, but also an exciting period of many firsts in your retirement. In addition to the celebration last week, there have been more accolades. Last week, trustees, I don't know if you are aware of this, but the EOSDN, which is the Eastern Ontario Staff Development Network, Board of Directors announced the 2021 recipient of the Eleanor Newman Award for Outstanding Service. And of course, the recipient was Mr. Sliwa. So congratulations on that recognition from your peers, Director. And secondly, Director, I know that you have not seen this scroll, and I'm not sure if you can see it here, everyone. I'm just going to read it to you. Dear Mr. Sliwa, I am pleased to extend my warmest greetings and congratulations to you on the occasion of your retirement after more than 30 years of service in Ontario schools. One of our greatest responsibilities as a society is to help our children to achieve their full potential. Over the course of your career in the field of education, you have held various roles, including that of both educator and administrator, culminating in your appointment as Director of Education of the Upper Canada District School Board. Your valued insight, leadership, and above all, commitment to student success have left an indelible imprint and will no doubt be sorely missed. Please accept my best wishes for every happiness as you begin this next chapter in your life. Sincerely, the Right Honourable Justin P.J. Trudeau. So, trustees, I know there are a number of you who have some comments, and if I'm missing you, please let me know. But Trustee Cram?
Thanks, Chair. Just a few brief comments. First of all, I want to thank Stephen for his service over the last 5 years. He's really taken us from one step that we needed to take to step 2, and really somewhat into step 3. So I appreciate that, Stephen. One thing I would like you to do, if you don't mind me giving some words of encouragement, please take time to get to know Michelle and your family. For the next 6 months, I would recommend you do absolutely nothing except what you want to do, just to get yourself relaxed and into a different frame of mind, because it's now a retirement and every day is every day. Get to enjoy your daughter's hockey games without having the pressure of cell phones and everything else that's going on. And most of all, best of luck in the future.
Thank you, Trustee Cram. Trustee Parizien, you indicated that you wanted to say a few words.
Yes, thank you. Through you, Chair. Stephen, I really wanted to wish you all the best on your retirement. This is something that at some point in your career you looked forward to, and now it's here. And now I'm sure as much as you are excited that you're going on vacation and going on to retirement, as it is nervous. And it's almost like a new job, because we're not sure what to expect. But I do want to wish you, from all my constituents, through the board, through my fellow trustees, all the best on this new adventure you're about to embark. Take time to relax, enjoy your family, and don't worry about us. We'll be okay.
Not sure about that, but anyway. Thank you, Trustee Parizien. Is there anyone else who would like to say a few words or comment?
I'd like to say something if I could.
Go ahead, Vice Chair.
Thank you. This is kind of what you might call the final kick at the can here. We're going to miss you, Stephen. And if there was a song going through my head right now, and actually there is, it would be, we're going to miss you when you're gone. But in reality, what's going through my head right now is one by Alice Cooper. And we all know that one, School's Out Forever. And I know Stephen probably has read an awful lot of books in his lifetime. And I remember reading a book one time when I was about 12 years old. And it was written in 1937. And it was simply called The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. And when you mention a Hobbit, everyone thinks of Frodo. But there was one Hobbit that came before Frodo, and that was Bilbo Baggins. And the hardest part of any journey is making the step from one chapter to the next. And that's the juncture that Stephen finds himself at. I think Bilbo Baggins put it nicely. Life is but a journey from here to there and back again. Here is now, and there is where your heart shall guide you and your feet shall take you. Thank you, Stephen, on behalf of everyone that's involved in public education in Eastern Ontario. We're going to miss you. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Bill. Anyone else? So, Steve, though on holidays, trustees, you should know that Steve is making himself available as needed and to help us all. And for that, I'm grateful. And finally, Steve, we thank you and we all wish you a happy retirement and thank you for your service to the communities of the Upper Canada and to the students of Upper Canada. So thank you very much. We are now going to proceed to item 1101, which is This Is Us videos. And this evening, 2 schools are featured. The first one, of course, is near and dear to my heart, as you know, Athens District High School, And the second one to Mr. Trustee McDonald's heart, Cornwall Collegiate and Vocational School. So Derek, I would ask you to proceed with those, please.
I think the school's been doing really well this year. I mean, the amount of change and the rate that it's coming at us has been unprecedented. And if you'd asked me before how I thought this would have went, I would have had big concerns. But I have to say, the students have stepped up, the staff have stepped up, and the school community as well. I think, you know, nobody likes the COVID restrictions, but I think that people are doing really well.
That's very different. We're wearing masks in school. We don't have any sports this year. Commencement's up in the air, no problem.
It's going pretty good. You know, the quadrimesters I like them. They're a lot less workload and stuff. It's just 2 classes.
My school year is going pretty good. Strange compared to others, but good.
Derek, are we having a bit of a problem here?
Mr. Chair, we'll be checking on where we're at with that. Just one moment, please.
Not being able to see people at school, but it wasn't bad. The teaching was really good for explaining stuff to you.
My experience with online learning was good. The only challenge I found was I struggled not having a teacher face-to-face to ask questions.
Having longer classes with class is obviously a challenge, and just having to wear masks too is a bit harder to breathe and stuff, but it's good.
Some challenges I have faced is a little bit of the workload, just with having so much school hours. The classes I find really long.
Well, just having to wear a mask all the time, and yeah, masks really annoying.
I think the school's going pretty well. Most people are following the rules, and it's been an adjustment for everybody, but we're all adjusting.
I think we're doing pretty well as a community and school. We've had not too many cases really.
I feel everyone has a little bit of extra added stress, but all considered, they adjusted really quickly and have done a great job at continuing in-person learning.
Just being at a school united, having COVID is a bit more challenges, but we're getting through it, so.
Thank you, Athens District High School, and we'll proceed with the next video from Cornwall Collegiate Vocational School.
That was extremely stressful, in my opinion. It was just very different, and I'm a social person, so I like to talk, and yeah, it just wasn't very fun.
It was kind of difficult, but at the same time, I kind of liked it. It was different, but it was overall decent.
It was
Pretty good. I did asynchronous, so I didn't have to attend the meetings, because if I did synchronous, I probably would have missed a bunch of them. And I got to sleep and do work whenever I wanted, so that was nice.
Well, it's a new experience that I have to navigate, which is at times can be difficult, but I get through it.
Online learning was definitely a challenge. I spent most of my day in my PJs on the couch learning, but it was hard to focus at some points, but I got through it.
It was difficult because, well, one, now everybody's at home, and, well, it's a lot of noise, feedback noise when you're trying to answer a question online. And the platform we're using, Teams, it was hard to use, but then once you used a lot, you get used to it.
Online learning, it was a little harder because it was hard to ask questions, but the teachers were there for us and they helped us through hard times, so it helped, yeah.
It's a little bit more difficult than you would think it would be, because I'm more of like a face-to-face learner, and it's a little bit harder for me to learn not face-to-face. Like, I have to like actually see it in real life and actually do it again.
I liked it, but I felt like I wasn't learning as much information as I would have if I was in school. And I didn't feel like me and my teacher were like connecting as we were if we were in class.
For the beginning part, it was really stressful with like dealing with everything, but once whenever I coped in with everything, it was going pretty well.
It's probably helping because it's harder to learn this way, but since it's harder, it'll be like later in life, it'll be easier to learn harder things. So it'll probably be better for college to learn that if they still do online.
I definitely got closer with my teachers, and we kind of got, now I can tell we see eye to eye with things and we understand each other more.
I'm hoping there will be, that kids will learn how to adapt and grow to the challenges that they face this year and become better students, and it will help them with their future.
Well, one, we can cope with it. So we learn through our mistakes, obviously, one. Second, we have a second chance, technically.
Yeah, I feel like it's like a new way of learning, and we learn like different things in class that we wouldn't learn normally.
I think we're gonna learn how to grow as a school and learn how to be a part but still engage with each other throughout what's the code again.
Yeah, I think it'll be a learning experience, and it'll really help us like make advancements in education, maybe science and everything.
Yeah, for sure. Like, it's all for the people around you. That's the whole point of what we're doing it.
Thank you, students from Athens District and CCBS in Cornwall. Some interesting takeaways there in that some of the students, and I quote, we learned how to grow. We have a second chance. I got through it. It says a lot about the resiliency of students and their coping mechanisms. So thank you, Derek, and thank you, students, for your insights. We appreciate that. Folks, it is my pleasure this evening, moving on to item 1201. I'm pleased to welcome the delegation from the Kemptville Campus Education and Community Center this evening. This delegation consists of Her Worship, North Grenville Mayor Nancy Peckford, who is also the past chair of this organization, as well as the new chair, Karen Cooper, whom I have not yet met, but I am looking forward to doing so tonight and later, as well as the campus project manager, Patricia Remillard. This is an exciting project for the Upper Canada District School Board, as you may have seen on Facebook and Twitter in the past week or so. It just provides new options for our students and a guaranteed job. So at this point, I welcome our guests, and I will turn the floor over to them. And I believe we're going to start with a PowerPoint presentation.
Yes. Hello, Chair McAllister. I was speaking. It was on mute, so thank you. Thank you so much, Chair McAllister and directors and trustees. Of course, director and trustees for letting us be here this evening. We certainly hope to not take too much time, but we felt it was incumbent upon us to alert you to some successes and transitions, both. So that really is the purpose of this evening's meeting. I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to introduce our new chair, while at the same time updating you. You might recall that we were, I think, before you just over a year ago to provide some crucial information in regards to a very special collaboration between the Upper Canada District School Board and Kemptville campus, and that was in regards to the Level 1 Commercial Vehicle and Equipment OYAP. Much has transpired since then. Of course, I think you're well aware that, in fact, the application to the province was successful, and that success was a little bit atypical, I must tell you. We were an unusual applicant in some respects when it came to the ministry's consideration of a TDA designation for the campus in partnership with the secondary school board. But by virtue of, I think, the strength of the partnership and the value, certainly to students in Eastern Ontario who were in the OYAP program, and emerging collaborations with our other school board partners. Certainly the ministry deemed it worthy to give the campus the TDA designation, which then subsequently enabled, of course, the Upper Canada District School Board and TR Leger specifically, which has had a long tenure on Kemptville campus, to occupy the Power and Equipment building. This building, as you may recall, was purpose-built and equipped for the kind of training and diesel mechanics and related trades that certainly the Upper Canada District School Board, the French Public Board, and soon, hopefully, all four boards would like to advance and offer to students on the campus. But really, the application that the Kemptville campus pursued in partnership and featuring the Upper Canada District School Board was absolutely crucial. So you are breaking new ground here, which is really exceptional, I think, for Kemptville campus and for residents, not just, of course, in our community, but across Eastern Ontario. Pat Premier will be discussing a few other developments as it pertains to trades, skilled trades on the campus. But I would like to say before introducing Ms. Cooper that as Mayor of North Grenville, and of course, in concert with my council colleagues, we are advancing a dialogue in regards to the proposed correctional facility that some of you may be aware of that was announced for North Grenville, Kemptville specifically, and the provincially farm side lands, which are distinct and separate from the Kemptville campus lands, but nonetheless are in close proximity to Kemptville campus. It was a surprise to us last August when a correctional facility was announced by the Premier at the time for those lands, but I must tell you we're having a very successful dialogue in terms of particular accommodations, adjustments, proximity, certainly of the correctional facility to Kemptville campus lands, and we look forward to reporting more on that in the coming months. But perhaps even, I think, more auspicious and exciting is that we also will welcome in 2022 the International Plowing Match to Kemptville campus, and they will, in fact, use some campus lands and some farm side lands that I've just referred to as part of a very large event that I think some of you are aware of and likely have attended. So we're extremely pleased to work with the IPM community and the Grenville Plowing Association in particular to organize and convene that event for the fall of 2022. So this brings me to the introduction of Ms. Cooper, and I want you to know that both Ms. Cooper and I value very much the partnership we have with the Upper Canada District School Board. I have to say it was one of the major highlights of my time as Kemptville Campus Chair was being able to work in a really strategic, focused, and innovative way with your board. I'm very, very pleased and honored to have had that opportunity, and I know Karen will carry on, in that spirit. So after an extensive search, you should know that North Grenville's Council appointed Ms. Karen Cooper as the new board chair, and that was at the end of March. Ms. Cooper is a lawyer by trade, was called to the Ontario Bar in 1995. She has been recognized as a leading expert in charity and not-for-profit law. That's not at all hurtful when we're running a federally incorporated not-for-profit at Kemptville Campus. That's the designation Kemptville Campus has as a not-for-profit corporation. So certainly Ms. Cooper's expertise in that area is very helpful. Ms. Cooper is also a sessional lecturer at Carleton University and is currently a part-time professor at the University of Ottawa's Faculty of Common Law. Certainly prior to becoming chair of the Kemptville Campus Board, she was chair. She served for a number of years as chair of the Kemptville District Hospital, Big Brothers Big Sisters. She's lived in North Grenville for over 20 years and, handily enough, is fluent in both French and English, which serves us well, given that we are a bilingual campus and, obviously working closely with 4 boards. As a consequence, I don't think there was any better candidate for this position than Ms. Cooper, and I know we're really excited to work with her as we continue to evolve our community and regional assets and recognize and leverage the enormous potential we have for the future. And then I think we'll leave it there. So, Ms. Cooper, I'll pass it over to you to talk substantively about some of the areas where you're putting some of the early focus as we move the campus forward. And thank you again, colleagues, and Director Sliwa. Thank you for coming back on for this meeting, and of course, Chair McAllister for giving us this space. And I know Ms. Cooper was having technical challenges, but I was assured she was on, so I think she's here somewhere. Karen, are you with us?
I know that Lisa Workman was working with Karen, and I just got a quick email from Lisa indicating that Karen was on.
She was having an audio problem earlier, so I'm hopeful she's just trying to activate her audio.
Not to worry, this is what our students and our teachers are going through daily.
Chair McAllister, I can work with Karen. I'll send her an email shortly to see if she is actually on the line still or whether she's having technical difficulties. If you would like to proceed or if you would like to wait, it's up to you. Thank you.
Pat, maybe we can go to an update on the skilled trades program and some of the areas
sure.
Yes.
Why don't I do?
Yeah.
Because actually I know that Derek is the is basically driving the slide deck. So why don't I just move to Derek, if you could take us to slide 12. That's perfect. And then what we can do is just backtrack when Karen Cooper gets on. So what I was going to do is actually just pick up from slide 11, and Chair Karen Cooper was going to reiterate the campus mandate. Now just speak to it briefly. So in terms of realizing the vision, this slide just provides a bit of additional context related to the 3 pillars: education and training, economic development, and health and wellness. And I just wanted to point out that the 3 pillars and overarching theme of sustainability were concepts that were first developed in 2018 as foundational to the campus strategic business and master plans. So, and they're still holding true. So under the education and training pillar, you've seen this before when we were here a year ago. The goal was and continues to be to introduce, to bring the 4 boards together and make use of the campus resources for everyone. So the intention is to leverage the campus assets to provide opportunities to support education, and specifically in programs like specialist high skills majors, micro-credentials, and certificates in the areas of ag, hort, food processing, forestry, the environment, entrepreneurship, innovation, and there will be more. And in addition, to facilitate adult and post-secondary education, and Mayor Peckford has already identified that the partnership with the Upper Canada District School Board has been a catalyst for the campus in this regard. So we are going to be looking to the other boards and industry associations to take similar leadership role to drive other programs forward. So under the health and wellness pillar, one goal is to pursue opportunities in music, arts and culture, leisure and recreation for our campus partners and for the greater community. We're also co-locating social services, children, youth and family well-being and mental health. Under ECDEV, we're attracting not-for-profit, for-profit, and committed to support entrepreneurship and social enterprise. Point being is the 3-pillar concept that was first developed in 2018 is indeed being realized. Derek, if you could go to the next slide, slide 13. Okay, perfect. So this is just a quick overview of current initiatives. So the first piece, master planning, next steps, we're now focusing on identifying short, mid, and long-term projects and looking at capital planning. The next 2 bullets speak to the commercial vehicle and equipment apprenticeship. So we all know that the OYAP and adult ed programs are either in play or the funding application is currently in progress. I'll speak to the RED, the Rural Economic Development application, and the AAFC application in the next slide. The campus has partnered with Kemptville Live in the library. They've done a really big pivot to virtual and is expanding their audience and their brand. Our agroforestry center is undergoing upgrades and will provide improved production capacity and opportunities for training. Forest management plan implementation is ensuring access to our forest and ensuring sustainable forest management. The IPM, Mayor Peckford has already spoken to that. So if we could go to slide 14. Perfect, thank you. So your board has provided a letter of support for this particular program. So the campus has applied to the RED program, the Rural Economic Development Program, for funding to develop a pilot program for agri-food youth entrepreneurship. So we are looking to 2 schools, not yours, you've already stepped up big time to take the lead, and it will be a bilingual program that will be open to students from all of the 4 boards. So the program will provide a combination of theory and experiential learning, and it'll introduce the concept of entrepreneur as a viable career path and alternative to traditional employment streams for today's youth. So the objective is to switch students' thinking around on entrepreneurship and expose them to business startups. So upon completion, the students will receive a certificate of completion, and we'll be looking at exploring linkages to education pathways. So that application was submitted at the end of January, and we're waiting to hear any time now. Now we'll go to slide 15. Perfect, thank you. So we're also applying to the Ministry of Ag and Agri-Food Canada, the Local Food Infrastructure Fund. Your board has also provided a letter of support for this program. So it's for funding to build local food production capacity at the campus. It's going to reposition the campus as a teaching and demonstration site for innovation, best practices, and applied research in agri-food. So what it does is it leverages existing agriculture capacity, which we have, and builds new capacity in partnership with industry and community partners. The objective is to localize food production through the creation of a sustainable social enterprise, and it will address food insecurities, strengthen local food systems, and engage and serve at-risk populations. Plan has 3 components. We're going to focus on the greenhouse, so upgrades to support vertical growing technology. We're going to convert a research lab into a small-scale food processing hub, and we're looking at land cultivation for seasonal fruit and vegetable crops. Originally, we were planning to submit this application at the end of February, but we've put a pause on it and we'll be submitting in September instead. The project is large, it's between 750,000 and $1 million, and the agricultural output is quite large. So we're developing right now. We're in the process of developing business plans for each of the project components. So this particular project really dovetails nicely with the youth entrepreneurship program if we're successful with that funding, and it also provides additional opportunities for potential micro-credentials and learning opportunities for students at all levels. Now, I'm wondering if we could check in to see if we have Karen, Chair Karen Cooper.
Hi, Patricia. It's Karen. Can you hear me?
Absolutely, and welcome.
Thank you.
Karen,
my apologies.
Karen, were you able to hear my introduction? You were introduced.
I heard that. If Derek could go to slide 4, I can pick it up there. I think that's
Wonderful.
Where we were.
Yep, sounds good.
As they say, best laid plans. Many apologies. It's certainly it's a pleasure to meet you over the phone. If not in person, I can see you. But for some reason you couldn't hear me, so many apologies. If you have slide 4 in front of you, that just outlines some of the priorities that I have beginning in this new position. I'm excited and was very pleased to accept the position of Kemptville Campus Board Chair, and really look forward to the challenges of the Kemptville campus and to continuing the excellent partnership with the Upper Canada District School Board that the campus has. One of the first priorities I have, and it remains ongoing, is being informed as to the operations, who the various tenants are, the boards, and the various groups that are on campus. Just also the status of the physical plant and the like. In addition, I've spent some time reaching out and meeting with various stakeholders. I'm happy to say I had the privilege of meeting with Director Stephen Sliwa, and we had a great discussion last week. And I'm really glad to have the opportunity to meet today with you. I thank you for the invitation to meet with you today, and I'm looking forward to further opportunities in the future. My focus has been to evolving the campus board from the transitional board of 3 directors to an arm's length board of potentially 10 board members. My calls just before this one were interviews with prospective candidates, and I have to say we've been really pleased with the applications that we received, 18 in total, and I've been able to shortlist it to some really excellent candidates. We're in the process of finishing the interviews, and our goal is to have a full board in place by the end of May. We'll be reconvening campus subcommittees. The 4 board meeting is currently scheduled for the 12th of May, and I'm looking forward to meeting with the 4 board representatives at that time and sort of beginning again the work of that very, very important committee. We've also working on discussions with the municipality of North Grenville to define and formalize the arm's length relationship that the campus has with the municipality. And that will drive the development of various policies and procedures relating to the operation of the campus. As I said earlier, we remain committed to the mandate that Patricia just outlined of the campus, and also of the partnership that we have with the Upper Canada District School Board. And I'm very committed to continuing that partnership and developing sustainable programming. If you could skip on to the next slide. There was a request to provide an update in terms of who the staff were. You've met Patricia, and she'll be staying on as program manager. She's currently acting executive director, and we are also in the process of recruiting a new permanent executive director. Hopefully we'll have somebody in place by the end of May, sometime in June. We have a campus coordinator, Cheryl DeVries, and she has day-to-day contact with the various tenants and the like. A facility manager, Bruce, and also a facility operator, Terry Turcott. Certainly, the board, once it's in place, will be taking a look at how that staff is structured and how best it can be structured in the future to meet the various needs of the campus. We're looking at some of our subcontracted supports and renegotiating some of those contracts. It is indeed a bit of a big job. The next slide, on slide 6, we've got all 17 campus buildings full or partially occupied. So we're at about 70% occupancy. As at February 2021, we had 193 full-time staff of our various tenants and 18 part-time staff, 525 full-time students. I certainly was not aware of that until I joined the board. We've got 51 daycare students plus another 50 some odd learning remotely. I think in the interest of time, I'm not going to spend too much time on the balance of the slides 7 through, I guess now it'll be 16. It just outlines who the various players are on campus, and I'll leave that for you to take a look at your leisure. So I could finish then perhaps on slide 16, if you don't mind changing that for me. And really that slide speaks to some of my next steps. Once we've got that board in place, an UED in place, hopefully soon, we'll be looking at refreshing the existing business and strategic plans. One of the things that really excited me when I was asked to join the board was my sense that much as I'm creating a bit of a board from nothing, and that's, I think, what struck me. It isn't from nothing. It's a new board, but key and important, thoughtful pieces of work have already been completed, such as the business plan, the strategic plan. The master plan that's available on our website was a big and important endeavor, and it's certainly going to guide our decision making going forward. We're in the process of looking at some short to medium to long-term priorities. One of them, for your information, that I identified almost right off the bat was dealing with the traffic planning on the campus. I was struck by having all of the young children on campus and the cars going through, and we've actioned just yesterday creating a working committee to make recommendations to the board to address that issue in the immediate term. We'll be looking at financial and capital plans, looking to increase revenue streams, working with the foundation. So lots of work there. Another thing that's going to be coming up is an RFP process for occupation and use of one of our key buildings, Purvis Hall. So that's a bit of an introduction in terms of what my priorities are and what some of our next steps. I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank Mayor Peckford for her guidance, Director Stephen Flewa for all of the insight that he provided me with last week, and I'm really looking forward to continuing the partnership with you. Thank you. I'm sure if any, yep, go ahead.
Go ahead, Mayor Nancy. Do you have anything you'd like to conclude with before I ask questions? Oh, you're on mute. I'm sorry.
Of course, I have 3 school-age children in the home, so I'm muting strategically. No, I just want to thank Ms. Cooper for her presentation and to say that we had always planned this transition, of course, between an interim board and a full board. It took a little bit longer because we decided to leverage some external expertise around a governance model that we thought would be appropriate, and that's sort of a framework with which Ms. Cooper is now working. So again, the timing is right for someone of Karen's caliber and expertise to come in, and as she said, to evolve the campus, but to continue to leverage, of course, the partnerships and the considerable groundwork that has been laid. And obviously, we're very pleased Pat Ramier has stayed with us during multiple transitions, because her insight and knowledge base is pretty crucial for us too. So that's it. We're here for any questions you might have, Chair McAllister, or welcome them, of course, from your trustees or Mr. Sliwa.
Thank you very much, Mayor Nancy. I would open the floor up to questions from our trustees.
It's Trustee Swan. Go
ahead, Trustee Swan.
I just want to thank you for the exciting presentation as trustee for the North Grenville area. I just welcome these opportunities that are being added to our educational experiences there. And I've been to TR Leger. I've seen many of the programs that are available, like My Local Markets on campus, and unfortunately the COVID testing site, but that was run really well. It was just an unfortunate opportunity that my son had to go there one day. But the one thing I wanted to, you mentioned traffic patterns, and I know I've seen it with the children and the security guard, and you can't go down a certain road. But I wanted to know too, will you be trying to work with Google and Google Maps? Because anytime I'm on that campus, the maps don't appear to work. And I've tried 2 different programs. So I'm just wondering, will this be kind of incorporated into that as well?
I'll let Karen answer that. Yeah.
I think that's a great question, and I'll certainly make sure that somebody takes a look at it. I've had the same experience, and so it's probably a matter of getting them on board and updating things, but that is obviously, as you can tell from tonight, beyond my technical expertise.
Thank you very much.
Trustees, do you have any other questions?
I have a comment.
Go ahead, Trustee McRae or Vice Chair.
Thank you. KCAT for Kemptville. I got a lot of great memories about it. It was basically the center and the heart of Eastern Ontario for my time in the junior farmers. And I really, really appreciate the revitalization of the diesel tech program. I've been in the shop, I've taken training there in my younger years, and it's an amazing, absolutely amazing opportunity for our students. But are you trying to recreate something that will resemble the former KCAT? Like I'm talking of diploma programs. I see in your presentation, you're talking of certificates of completion. And admittedly, we're shooting for perhaps a younger market than the former college did. Like most of the kids that attended KCAT were high school graduates. Now we're reaching out to students that are working to graduate. And I guess my question is are you going to expand your offerings? As a parent of a son that wants to farm, I know there's a great many programs that you can offer. Like I say to them, every certificate you get in your pocket helps. And I'm talking about your WAMIS training, your falls and arrest training, your grower pesticide training, chainsaw operator certificate. So are we are you going to expand your offerings as time goes on? I guess that boils down to my question. Thank you.
I'm happy to maybe just quickly address this and then pass it over to Pat and Karen. I certainly can say, you know, what drove the collaboration that we have with you, with the Upper Canada District School Board, was a clear acknowledgement that with the departure of the campus, there was a major loss for the agricultural community in particular when it came to skills training. And while we can't, you know, we can't become a college, at the same time, I think there are niches and opportunities to provide some of that skills training, especially given where the trend is in secondary school education and beyond, and alternative high schooling, et cetera. So I think I'll pass it over to Pat, perhaps, and Ms. Cooper, of course, if you want to add something. But we are very cognizant, and certainly I know Mr. Sliwa has been at the United Counties of Leeds and Grenville table, I think alongside Chair McAllister, and there is a very strong appetite in Eastern Ontario, certainly in the United Counties of Leeds and Grenville and beyond, to do whatever we can to recognize and fill some of those gaps where it's strategic and viable to do so. We will not become a college, that's clear, but there are other opportunities, and you are among them. And the partnership we have with Upper Canada gave us a chance to do something that was meaningful and very important, I think, for the agricultural community.
Trustee Parisien, I believe you have a question.
Yes, thank you. Through you. Sorry.
I'm sorry, just didn't know if I think Pat might want to add something to just
yes,
really answer that question.
For sure, just very quickly, if I could, and I would say the short answer to are we going to be restoring the programs that we had when we were a campus of the University of Guelph? The short answer is no. But what's happened is I think the partnership that we have with the campus. The campus partnership with the Upper Canada Board is actually leveraging the adult ed mandate that all the school boards have, and exploring the options under, within that opportunity. So basically, the start is the level 1 OYAP, Ontario Youth Apprenticeship. The second opportunity is the same program, slightly different format, to an adult target, underemployed, unemployed, careers in transition. There's a huge need for apprenticeship training and a huge interest in apprenticeship training right now, basically because of COVID. The next place that I would suggest that we would go to is level 2 and level 3. So yes, these programs are restored because we did have those in play when we were at the University of Guelph, but they're demand driven. These are needed right now. A diploma, I don't believe that a diploma is on the horizon, but I think, as Mayor Peckford said, there are many, many niche opportunities that we can actually use the program that we're starting with as a springboard. I hope that helps.
Thank you. Trustee Parisien?
Great, thank you. And thank you all for this amazing presentation. I am probably, or my ward is probably quite far from Kemptville. We're about an hour away. However, we are, all of Prescott-Russell is a huge agricultural community. And I want to make sure that we're able to attend, our students or our young adults are able to also have access definitely to your programs. I'm not sure about transportation. I'm thinking after COVID as well. And just to make sure that this is a definitely opportunity. So we'll definitely have to keep the discussions and the conversations flowing, even though we're far. I can see it being an amazing opportunity for our students to have like a greater sense of training in the agricultural community.
I think it was always yeah, and I think it was always intended to be inclusive of the region, right? And certainly very well aware of Prescott Russell and some of the drivers and the catalysts, in fact, even for the partnership came from teachers that were nowhere near North Grenville, but were part of the Upper Canada District School Board at Tugwa and other places, you know, so it's intended to be an inclusive opportunity across the region.
Perfect, wonderful, thank you.
Thank you. Would there be any other questions? Hearing none, thank you, Mayor Peckford and Ms. Cooper and Ms. Rameyard for your presentations. Mayor Peckford, thank you for your leadership in particular, because I know when you began this, it was a daunting task. And Ms. Rameyard, you are the operator with your hands on the levers, and we look forward to realizing your goals and our goals as a partner. Ms. Cooper, we're looking forward to an expanded governance role, and we're very excited about this. And as you know, you have the support of our board in spades. So on that note, I'm going to thank you very much for your presentation, and we wish you well, and rest assured of our continued cooperation and participation.
Thank you very much.
Thanks again for all of your support.
Good night, Ms. Cooper, Ms. Mayor Nancy. Yep, good night.
Bye-bye.
All right, at this point, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to move to report of the policy committee, and I have 5 motions. And before I get to them, I'm going to turn this over to Trustee Cram, the chair of the policy committee.
Thank you, Chair. Policy committee met on June 30th, or sorry, March 30th, at which time we discussed 11 policies. We did report back to the board on April 7th with 1 new policy that we were developed on menstrual products in our schools. And tonight we're coming forward with 5 policies. We will be bringing 5 more on May the 12th, and we'll have our next meeting on May the 17th. So with that, I will try to bring up the PowerPoint presentation and leave the motions to you, Chair, to bring forward.
Thank you. So we're ready for motion number 1. And I have a motion moved by Trustee Parisien, seconded by Trustee McDonald, that the Upper Canada District School Board approve policy 112, student health, as reviewed with revisions April 28th, 2021. Trustee Parisien, I'll turn the floor over to you, please.
Thank you. Through you, Chair, I don't believe it's up on your screen. Oh, there you go. Oh, perfect. So as the committee reviewed this policy, there was only one sort of wording addition that we saw on page 2 here, as you can see highlighted in yellow, which was including the wording policy and program memorandum to reference 161, supporting children and students with prevalent medical conditions in schools. It was just the wording there that was missing from the overall policy. Otherwise, we didn't see any new changes that were needed.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Hearing none, trustees, I would ask you to cast your ballot on this particular motion. I'm told by our trustee liaison officer, Ms. Workman, that the motion carries. So we're going to move to motion number 2. It's moved by trustee McDonald, seconded by trustee Pattisier, that the Upper Canada District School Board approve policy 124, Code of Conduct with appendix as reviewed with revisions April 28th, 2021. And I'll turn the floor over to trustee McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There are 2 components to this policy. You will have the policy 124, and then you also have the appendix. I'll go through the policy first. So extensive review of the policy was conducted by the policy committee at our previous meeting. We went through to ensure that we were relevant to current legislation, relevant to our insight by the ministry when it comes to code of conduct, and also any other legislation that might be at play or any other legal framework. The only real change that we made within the policy is at the bottom section, where we've added a piece here indicating that this code of conduct is not related to medical needs of a child. Just making a distinction that we can, in that particular section above, that we do for the use of medications for students. So if a student is using any of the items that are listed for their medical needs, then it would not be subject to the policy. If we flip over to the appendix, a few pages on the appendix. The appendix is really taken from the legislation, and we've used that to make sure that we are in adherence to the legislation, and use that in our own mechanism while we're looking to enforce or looking to use the policy. The areas that we've adjusted are on page 3 and I think page 4. Page 3, the bottom, there's a footnote here where it indicates that in the document, we're just making reference to what parent means. The legislation in the appendix, it makes reference to a parent, and without adding all the other definitions of what a parent might be, we've added the footnote to ensure that we're using the Education Act, but it does include a guardian, and it could include any other close family members that might be caregivers for a child. On the last page, page 4, the section, the last sentence actually, we've just taken out the area that says the Code of Conduct and its policy 124, the Code of Conduct would be reviewed annually. The policy is to be reviewed by the policy committee. The appendix would be reviewed by the Director of Education to ensure that it's in compliance and adherence to all requirements. That's all I have for you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Hearing none, I would ask you to cast your ballot, please.
Mr. Chair, that motion carries.
Thank you, Ms. Workman. We are now going to move to motion number 3. It's moved by trustee Cram, seconded by trustee McDonald, that the Upper Canada District School Board approve policy 203, appointment of administrative and supervisory personnel, as reviewed with revisions April 28th, 2021. Go ahead, trustee Cram.
Thank you, Chair. This particular policy have no additions to it at all. The only thing we did do was there was a legal reference required to add to the top of the document.
So, trustees, I imagine you would like to cast your ballot immediately. Proceed.
Mine's down. I'm in favor. I'm afraid.
Chair McAllister, that motion carries.
Thank you. We are now going to proceed to motion number 4. It's moved by Trustee Parizan, seconded by Trustee Cram. That the Upper Canada District School Board approve policy 205, criminal background checks, policy record checks, vulnerable sector screening, as reviewed with revisions April 28th, 2021. Trustee Parizan?
Wonderful, thank you. Through you, Chair. This policy, we've made several changes. We've added the legal reference at the top to the Ontario Regulation 521-1, collection of personal information, as well as we've removed the word police record check and used the proper terminology as criminal background check. As well as you can see, we've added some, I could read it, but I believe everyone can read the attachments that they've received. Going forth, we've also added a section A and B and removed that the Upper Canada District School Board will require all volunteers who may be in contact with students to provide evidence of a valid criminal background check, vulnerable sector screening, and really put it into a more clear policy above in yellow. If there's any questions, it would be my pleasure to answer. John, you're on mute.
Sorry about that, trustees. If there's no further discussion, would you please cast your ballots?
Chair McAllister, that motion carries.
Thank you very much. That is why.
Chair McAllister, that motion carries.
Thank you. We are going to move to motion number 5. It's moved by Trustee Cram. Code of Conduct, Trustees Board Members, as reviewed April 28th, 2021. Trustee Cram, you will speak to this.
Thank you, Chair. We're not recommending any changes to the Code of Conduct for the trustees and board members, just leaving it as it is. And my apologies to Lisa, but I still haven't figured out how to go from the slide presentation to voting. So as chair of the committee, if you could please make sure you add my name to voting in favor in each of the particular things.
Any questions, trustees?
I have a question.
Go ahead, Vice Chair.
Thank you. Sounds like somebody's running an outboard. Okay, I'll try to get in here real quick. I realize this code of conduct applies only to trustees and board members. I guess this is a question, and perhaps it's not pertaining to the motion, but a great many boards in Ontario are starting to adopt a code of conduct for their appointed committees. I just wonder if there's been any consideration at the policy level to address that issue.
Trustee Cram.
Thank you, Chair. At this point, there hasn't been Trustee McPherson, but certainly if the board wanted a policy committee to look at that, we would do that.
Thank you. I just needed a bit of clarification there. I do know that a fair number of boards are starting to bring them in.
Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Trustee McDonald.
Yeah, we do have the code of conduct policy that is all-encompassing, policy 124. It does deal with all members of the school community, especially people in positions of authority, but it would pertain to any individual that would be engaged in school or board activity that are not board members.
Yeah, so what you were saying essentially is this is pertinent to board members only.
The last one is, but 124 could be applied to committees.
Right. Is that satisfactory, Vice Chair?
When I was doing my research on the some of the structures of the boards in Ontario, some of them have brought in specific code of conduct for appointed board members, for committee members, I mean. But if 124 addresses the situation, I think we can just leave it at that.
Any further questions? I have a question for you, Trustee Cram. Since there are no changes to this policy, is there a need for a vote?
I would assume that there would be, Chair, in order to make sure that the date of revision for it is part of the document.
Okay, thank you. Trustees, would you please cast your ballot?
Chair McAllister, that motion carries.
Thank you very much, Ms. Workman. We are going to proceed to Article 1401, which is the environmental education in the Upper Canada District School Board. And I'm going to turn the floor over to either Director Siwa and then Bill Loshaw, Superintendent, or directly, however you wish to do it.
Mr. Chair, just checking with you, I think we have the SEAC report first from Vice Chair McPherson.
You are so right. Is it ever? That's wonderful. Why we have a secretary of the board. I apologize, Vice Chair. So 1302, we're going to move to the report of the Special Education Advisory Committee. Vice Chair McPherson, would you like to go ahead?
Thank you. Don't worry. It takes a lot to offend me. We met on the 6th of April, again, remotely via MS Teams. And we had our first presentation was really, really interesting. They talk about education being a community endeavor. And right now I believe it's a pilot project, but Deanna can correct me if I'm wrong, about early years collaboration. And basically it says that every student has a right to learn how to read. And it was actually quite a long presentation that stimulated a fair amount of discussion. And it's pretty much outlined in the report here as to some of the things that we're doing to reach out to some of our harder to reach students. And essentially what it says is early years learning partners will work collaboratively with kindergarten educators and school-based teams to improve student achievement in early literacy, student wellness, growth and development in self-regulation, social learning. And the presentation, basically, we're well on the road to success. And I must commend the staff for coming up with some of these really great ideas. Superintendent's report, basically we are seeing an increase in numbers of COVID in the schools. Staff are doing an absolutely amazing job at keeping the schools safe and open to students. As was mentioned previously, we are starting to staff for next year's school year, as well as we're also getting ready to start collecting some of the attendance data for our high needs students, again, for allocation of staffing. The invitation was extended to SEAC members as well to the Board of Trustees, I believe, to participate in an online course called The Ripple Effect of Resilience by Monique Grace Smith. This is a self-directed course. It occurs in 6 different modules, and it speaks very broadly to wellness and specifically to understanding the needs and the experience of Indigenous people in Canada. That pretty much sums it up. It was a great meeting, and thank you.
Trustees, do you have any questions? Hearing none, thank you, Vice Chair or Chair of SEAC. I appreciate your presentation and your work on this file. We're now going to move to Article 1401, Environmental Education in the Upper Canada District School Board. And I'll turn this over to you, Director Sliwa and Superintendent Loshaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, we appreciate the opportunity as staff to bring this report forward to the board tonight. You know, it might have been a while since we've touched upon environmental education and where the school district is at. And so I think the timing is right for the report, and we know that trustees have a natural interest in this topic, knowing that we are primarily a rural school district, that there is an increased awareness about global consciousness among our students, their families, the local community, and certainly our staff. And of course, Mr. Chair, you know, we also are very reliant upon agriculture and food production in our area to keep us and our families fed and our societies healthy. So it's no wonder that Upper Canada has been invested in this area for well over a decade. Mr. Loshaw will be bringing a report this evening, but what he'll be sharing with you is that when we talk about environmental education, I would like trustees to think about that it's education about the environment, for the environment, and takes place in the environment. And so we have lots of examples that we like to share with you this evening, including the fact sheet that you see, the one-pager summary sheet you see up on the screen at this point, and it's also in your agenda package. So, Mr. Chair, I'll turn this over to Superintendent Loshaw, and then we'll see if there's any questions from the board. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Director Sliwa, and through you, Mr. Chair, it's my pleasure to provide trustees with a brief update on our current state of environmental education within our district. In preparing for this update, members of our teaching and learning team really had an opportunity to conduct an environmental scan, so to speak, across our system in order to review goals and strategies in this area, in order to identify strengths in our schools and at the system level, and also to establish next steps with respect to fulfilling our board's commitment to environmental education. In terms of background, as outlined in Policy 415, all students and staff should be involved in the development of programs that contribute to an environmentally friendly place to work and learn. Environmental education should be integrated into the curriculum, and professional learning opportunities or professional development learning opportunities in the area of environmental education should be offered to all educators. As well as trustees are aware, the policy speaks to the way in which the board values programs and practices that foster respect for the environment, reduce waste, and also encourage recycling in all aspects of our board operations. Policy 415 is supported by a 2009 Ministry Policy Framework document titled Acting Today, Shaping Tomorrow, and the framework outlines 3 goals which are organized into the following themes: teaching and learning, student engagement and community connections, and environmental leadership. So the first goal really promotes learning about environmental issues and solutions, and it speaks to the importance of helping students understand their connections to each other, to the world around them, and to all living things. The second goal focuses on the environment, or environmental stewardship rather, by promoting student participation in environmental projects that link schools and communities. And the third goal stresses the importance of providing students with opportunities in terms of engaging in responsible environmental practices. So the document really outlines the way in which environmental education will be a part of every student's learning experience. And it speaks to the importance of developing personal and organizational practices that help reduce our environmental footprint. And in essence, it really forces students and staff to think critically, to feel deeply, and to act wisely with respect to the environment. So in terms of our current state, currently environmental education in our schools is being addressed through curriculum expectations that are being embedded into all grades and all subject areas as appropriate. And it's important to note that there are two primary supporting documents. One is the environmental education scope and sequence of curriculum expectations for elementary, and the other, of course, is the environmental education scope and sequence curriculum document for secondary. And educators use these documents to inform their program planning, to seek out opportunities to support the development of skills and knowledge in the area of environmental education. And at the elementary level, then most aspects of environmental education can be found in the science, social studies, history, and geography curriculum. And in the secondary curriculum, some subject areas are more closely linked to the study of environmental education than others, but certainly there are opportunities in all subject areas. Also, with respect to the current state, important to note that many of our schools offer a range of school-based environmental initiatives, such as outdoor learning spaces, community gardens, community partnerships, and environmental clubs. Also, at a system level, environmental education is being addressed through system portfolios, such as Indigenous education, experiential learning, and through outdoor education initiatives. So, and one other area I would say at a system level that I would draw everyone's attention to is the fact that environmental education is being delivered through specialist high skills major programs that focus on the environment, of course, but also on the agricultural sector. So at this point in time, I'd just like for us to take a moment to watch a short video that captures many of the opportunities that have been provided to our students. And Derek, I think you're driving, so I'll just ask you to, if you could tee that up, please.
We need everything you can here. Thank you for providing us with what we need. Thank you for giving us life and earth. Thank you for keeping us alive by providing us with food. Thank you for providing us with everything you need, but some of us disrespect you and that needs to change.
So Derek, thanks for your help with that. And I would say based on our environmental scan of the system, then the teaching and learning team certainly feels that there's a focus on environmental education, both within our schools and at the system level. And yet, having said that, we also believe that there are steps that can be taken to ensure that we are fulfilling our board's commitment to environmental education. And specifically, we feel that we could be more coordinated in our approach to teaching environmental education across the district. So to that end, we believe that it would be beneficial to gather more specific information about those school-based activities, environmental education activities that are taking place, and to follow up by ensuring that there's a process or a structure in place so that schools could learn from one another in terms of what other schools are offering their students. We also think that we could be more intentional at the system level to support schools in making connections with environmental education and board priorities, such as the Board Improvement Plan for Student Achievement and Wellness, our Board Action Plan for Indigenous Education, as well as experiential learning and outdoor education initiatives. And in essence, what we'd be doing in looking at all this is taking the work of environmental education that we see right now as being implicit and making that work more explicit. So really that concludes the snapshot of where we're at currently with respect to environmental education across the district, and I would be pleased to answer any questions that trustees have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Loshaw. Trustee, do you have any questions that you'd like to pose about this report?
I've got a question or a comment.
Go ahead, Trustee McRae. Or Trustee McPherson.
Yeah. Thank you. I have known for years that this has been going on behind the scenes, and we just haven't been paying it quite as much attention. I was glad to see that you did feature one of my schools. Got to make a comment, and then I'm going to pose a question to you. I'm a graduate of the #1 experiential learning program, and that's the 4-H movement. We have a whole series of programs and clubs that are basically based upon sustainability in the environment. It's learn to do by doing. And I really think it's nice to see the board stepping into that path. So my question is this: given the variety of engagement across our board in programs such as this, is there a reflection of which community the school is based in? If you take a school that's based in a largely rural, agrarian community, does it show more engagement than a school that's, say, located in a large urban center? Let's compare Lanark Highlands to Cornwall. I'll just pose that question to you.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I believe the question really speaks to the need that we identified in terms of having more specific information about the school-based initiatives that schools are offering. We know that a number of our secondary schools offer specialist high skills major programs. Some of those are in agriculture. Some are tied to the environment. We also know that many of our small rural schools take pride in their outdoor learning spaces. So at this particular point in time, it would be difficult to comment on one school location over another in terms of their level of engagement. And I think part of the next step going forward is to determine that so that schools could learn and work with one another.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any further questions?
Mr. Chair, it's John McRae. Maybe I would jump in there if I could.
Go ahead, Trustee McRae.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My understanding, Bill, is that urban windowsill gardens, and there's a lot of varieties. It's I hope that if the will is there in any group of people, if there's a champion in the room, and there's some funding that goes towards it, and it doesn't have to be an overwhelming amount of funding, but there needs to be a champion in the school, and they need to bring it forward. And there's a lot of work being done in urban food growing as well as rural, where it comes maybe perhaps a little more naturally, but that's my response. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Trustee McRae. Are there any further questions? Hearing none, thank you very much, Superintendent Loshaw. We've heard a lot about this, and we look forward to your next report. and seeing how we can move the needle on this even further.
Thank you very much.
So I thank you. At this point, trustees, we're going to move to Article 1402, which is the monthly update number 6, potential funding sources, response to motion carried July 15, 2020. And Director, I don't know if you want to introduce this or anyway, I will introduce you and Executive Superintendent of Business, Jeremy Hobbs.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, members of the board will recall that on July 15th, 2020, when the board passed its budget for the 2020-2021 year, there was also a motion requesting that the board receive updates with regards to specific funding that supports COVID-19 expenses and also any other expenses, any other funding that may have some discretion with regards to how the board can commit those funds to improve and support students' experiences in our schools. So, Mr. Chair, tonight our Chief Financial Officer, Mr. Hobbs, will bring forward that update in accordance with the direction from the board from July. And as you know, Mr. Chair, we bring these updates periodically to the board. I'll turn it over to Mr. Hobbs.
Thank you, Director Sliwa and Mr. Chair and trustees. It's my pleasure again to bring forward this more or less monthly report. Trustees will recall that our last report of this nature was on March 10th of this year, where we attempted to bring trustees up to speed on all of the sources of revenue that we have received to support COVID or for other significant purposes since the passage of the original budget on July 15th of 2020. Since that time, there hasn't been huge substantial changes. What you will see happening in most cases is that amounts that or sources of funding that were previously announced to March 10th but hadn't had a specific number attached to them, we now know most of those numbers. And so the numbers are significant, but there really haven't been a lot of new announcements, just more clarity on what the actual UCDSB allocation is. And because tonight I will be bringing you 2 reports, this one and then a budget outlook for the next school year, 21-22, I am actually not having a PowerPoint here. I thought I'd spare you 2 PowerPoints in a row and speak directly to the report in the body of the board doc. So if you'd like to follow along, the best way to do that will be to just follow along with the report directly in board docs, and I'll refer back to that report. So really the content for this evening is comprised of 2 major tables. And the first table, which is table 1 in the body of that report, is a list of new sources of revenue that have been announced since the monthly update 5 presented on March 10th, 2021. So again, in many cases, there had been announcements of funding in most of these categories. Previous to that, we just didn't know specifically what our share of that funding would be, and therefore we're bringing it forward at this time. So what you see in table 1 is under the heading of COVID-related funding supports. There were a series of announcements on March 25th and March 26th of this school year, $224,000 for funding to support student mental health, $211,000 to support summer learning for students with spec ed needs, $66,000 for reading supports, $88,000 for summer evidence-based reading intervention programs, $37,000 for targeted math and literacy supports focused on de-streaming, which as we know is coming. A small amount for summer learning supports as part of transportation and stability supports. And then the big piece here is you may be aware of the federal resilience, COVID-19 resilience stream of the federal infrastructure program. This was announced in the fall timeframe, and it was an application-based process by which boards were invited to identify a number of projects in a series of categories presented by the federal government that they might wish to undertake. Those projects were then evaluated by the Ministry of Education and shortlisted, and then further, the ministry shortlist was then further reviewed by the federal government and further shortlisted, and then in the first quarter of this year, we found out our share, and that share is $10.2 million of capital funding. So that's funding that is a little bit different than what we would normally receive for capital funding, where we would receive money for a large project, or we would receive money that we could generally apply towards a category. This tends to be funding a lot of smaller projects, specifically designed to support a long-term kind of stance that would be responsive to not just COVID-19, but to reducing vulnerabilities associated with the pandemic in our schools. So things that would promote distancing. What you would, as an example, what you'd see here is, I think the number is about 340 water bottle filling stations to replace traditional water drinking fountains. Other mechanisms that are going to reduce the incidence of students having to contact surfaces and so on. But that's those projects are actually getting out to tender and design right now, and we expect to have most of those hopefully complete by the end of the year. So totaling, all told, obviously with the bulk of that being the capital, about $10.9 million has become sort of added to our really significant list of funding associated with the COVID response. And then non-COVID related funding supports, we see $32,000 for an AQ subsidy for math courses, and then a $22,000 for a summer Indigenous grad coach program, totaling $55,000. So this $10.973 million you see here, excuse me, at the bottom of Table 1, represents an addition to our total that we presented on March 10th. So moving forward in the board docs document here, Table 2 is what we're trying to do now as a finance department is to, I call these sort of an evolution table, which is to show you how things have changed over the course of the year, just as a reminder. So what you see here in Table 2 is to show you, going back to original October report, or even before that, we identified 5 broad categories of additional funding that was available to the organization for either COVID or COVID-related type responses, at least in theory. If you look at row 1, it refers to uncommitted staffing supports, and so trustees may recall, associated with the settlement of central collective agreements, QPO, SSTF, FO. Last year, there were a number of incremental funding sources provided by the provincial government associated with those collective agreement settlements, totaling $2.968 million. Obviously came with a series of constraints associated with the settlement of the collective agreement, and those amounts have been allocated out as per the terms of the collective agreement. So there is no money remaining in that amount that was in theory available to us in October. Further, in the course of the budget process, trustees will recall that we were at that time looking for potential contingencies that could assist us in our dealing with the COVID-19 response. At the time, we identified about $4.74 million of potential funding that we could potentially allocate towards some parts of the COVID response. That is held pretty steady all year, except for in the March report that jumped up to $6.5 million, largely due to the fact that at the start of the year there was considerable uncertainty about whether we would be able to realize our full slate of applications for SIP funding, totaling $3.1 million. So we budgeted conservatively initially. Partway through the year, I think in the December timeframe, the Ministry of Education signaled that they would ensure that we had that full amount, even if we weren't able to complete all the applications due to the pandemic situation. So knowing then that we had the full $3.1 million in SIP funding meant that we were able to bump up that contingency identified in budget from about $4.7 million to $6.5 million. As it stands right now, we have about $2.3 million remaining that is unspent. And what you would see, the note below the table explains what that is composed of. It's largely composed of deferred revenue from 2019-20, the Rural and Northern Education Fund representing about $1.5 million of that, and also some uncommitted RNEF funding from 2020-21, about $500,000. As you know, a good chunk of our RNEF funding for 2021 was used to support our distance learning team and offering, and so we have about 500,000 left of that. So that $2.3 million is all told outlined there. In line 3, there was, of course, thanks to the provincial and federal governments, really wealth of COVID-related funding supports to assist us in all aspects of the COVID response, from the acquisition of PPE to staffing concerns to buying signage and to equipping our schools. And so that has evolved over the course of the year from $6.6 million in the October 2020 timeframe to, as we see today, about $22 million. And that jump from the March report, where we were at $11 million in total, to $22 million is really entirely described in Table 1. So that really represents the vast amount of that is the COVID resilience infrastructure capital funding that I described moments ago and is outlined in the table above. There's been a series of course, non-COVID related PPFs. So these would be probably more typical of the PPFs we would see in the course of a regular school year. Again, not significant change associated with those PPFs since our last report, and again, largely described above as well. And then finally, in terms of other deferred revenue, a number of other sources of deferred revenue, which is held fairly consistent for the entire year, totaling $2.5 million. I believe well over half of that amount is SIA, special equipment amount, deferred revenue that is there to support the technology and learning support needs of special education students. So that really represents the bulk of that $2.5 million, and is something that has been in place for, I would say, over a decade, and the IT department largely works collaboratively with the special education department to draw that down on an ongoing basis as student needs demand. And so all told, what you can see here at the bottom here is that if you total up all of those incremental sources of funding in this extraordinary year, capital and operating across all categories, about an incremental $36 million we've received to support the broad scope of programs, COVID and non-COVID related, since the original budget was passed on July 15th, 2020. And that represents my summary of this report. Mr. Chair, I would be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Superintendent Hobbs. Trustees, the floor is open to you. Questions, please.
Well, I'll lead off, John, if I may. Chair McAllister.
Go ahead.
John McCrae.
Yes.
Thank you. I want to get this on the record. I may have mentioned this before, but it seems to me, from what I can gather, that ventilation in learning spaces should always have outside air coming in low and updrafting and being exhausted out above. And that's the best thing we can do. Is that your understanding or not, Jeremy?
It's an interesting question. Certainly what we try to do is follow the ASHRAE, which is the, I forget what the acronym is, but it essentially is really an association of engineers that publish standards related to ventilation and heating and air conditioning. And we really try to follow those standards to the extent possible. There is some, when it comes to actually the best way to prevent COVID, I think that there are some questions there, and there's questions that was raised on a call as recently as last week around the value of how much do you want to circulate the air in a classroom when you have a potentially airborne pathogen versus how much, so there's some questions there. But generally speaking, I think what you want to have happen is that you want to have the air in a school replaced or turned over such that you end up with a healthy level of circulation, and mechanically how that happens to maintain thermal comfort versus pathogen control are it may not entirely be the same thing. And so I think we're really still trying to figure out what the ideal balance is in engineers' minds.
If I may follow up, Mr. Chair?
Yes, by all means.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, the suggestion is that it really is not that complicated, that you want in an enclosed space where people gather. The problem is that the droplets are so fine now that that's what has changed, is our belief that these droplets can go quite a distance. But if there is sort of an upward flow all the time, that it takes out in all of the room. Now, I'm no expert, but it's suggested that it's just the volume of air in an enclosed space has changed. Now, I don't mean to oversimplify it, because I am simple. There we are. Thanks.
I think, Trustee McRae, you're getting into the how. Honestly, I think you've had the best response you can get from Superintendent Hobbs.
All right.
Are there any other further questions? Superintendent Hobbs, I have one question for you.
Sure, thank you.
Of the remaining amounts on table 2 especially, if unallocated or unused, what happens?
Well, through you, Mr. Chair, I'll give you maybe a good example would be the $2.3 million. So certain categories of our funding that we receive is designated for a specific purpose and is open for deferral, essentially. And what that essentially means is, that we are allowed to essentially carry it forward, if you will, for lack of a better term, for the next year. In other cases where you have funds that are not quote unquote deferrable, and a good example of this might be, if I don't spend money on snow plowing, for example, in facilities operations, that money, if unspent at the end of the year, would become part of the board's broader accumulated surplus available for compliance. And as we've discussed in previous, presentations, that is not as easily accessible. The board would have to be prepared to run a deficit in the next year in order to essentially access that. However, deferred revenue, such as rural and northern education funds, the tutoring allocation, pretty much all of that $2.3 million would not become part of the board's accumulated surplus available for compliance and would be entirely available to us for use within the constraints associated with that funding source in the following year. So it's not lost.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any further questions on this aspect of the report? Hearing none. I'm sorry, go ahead, Trustee Barry.
Are we still projecting a deficit budget of 1.9 million? With all those sources of money, is the deficit effective?
Through you, Mr. Chair, actually, the team is preparing financial forecast number 3 right now. So we expect to bring that back in the next month or so. So trustees will get a better and more definitive sense of how these sources of revenue would impact the deficit, if at all. Generally speaking, what I would say is in most cases when we receive a source of funding, for example, summer learning for students with special education needs, $211,000, as you see in Table 1. The only way that could help our deficit is if we chose not to spend that amount. And really what we do is we really have an obligation to, when we receive funding that's targeted for a specific use and a specific time, we do everything we can to use it for the intended purpose. So generally speaking, these amounts, I would say, will not help our deficit posture, especially the capital funding, because that our capital budget sort of occurs outside of the normal operational budget for a variety of reasons. So I would generally say the answer is no. If you're looking for sort of signs of light that may help us, the biggest thing I think that would help the financial posture in terms of the deficit is the fact that we're in a continual lockdown state, and therefore, if it's anything like last year, what you'll see happen is we just spend less money because we're not doing many of the normal school operations things. But I wouldn't want to predispose financial forecast number 3 at this time any further than that.
Thank you.
I suspect you will further answer Trustee Barry's question in your next segment, which is 1403, the 2020-2021 budget outlook. Am I correct?
Well, you know, I actually, Mr. Chair, I actually don't think I titled that line item correctly, because I really should have titled it 21-22. The 21-22 budget outlook. We're really actually starting to now talk about next year. So I apologize for not
I'm just
titling that.
my script. So why don't we move directly into 1403, which is the 21-22 budget outlook?
Yeah. Can trustees see my PowerPoint? I'm not sure if I'm sharing that correctly.
Yes.
Yeah, we can see it. We can see it, Jamie.
Perfect. So, believe it or not, I'm an IT guy, but they keep inventing new IT to confuse me with. So, you know. So I'm on slide 1 here. And again, what I'd like to do with trustees is just re-emphasize that my last presentation was really a talk about what's happening in the 2020-21 school year from a financial standpoint. And what I'd like to do now is turn our attention to the next year. So what do we see happening for the 21-22 budget year? And I was very appreciative earlier of the chair's remarks and his earnest efforts to keep the pressing on the minister to release the GSNs, because we're as anxious as anybody is to find out what our funding for the next school year is. But even though we're still waiting for the GSNs, there's an awful lot that we can do to capitalize on the knowledge and experience of our talented teams across the organization to make a good guess at what we think is going to happen and what it's going to look like next year. So really what I'd like to do tonight is present that first flavor or that first outlook at what we see our budget for the upcoming year looking like. And I'll just walk you through that tonight. So slide 2 here is my executive summary slide. And again, the purpose tonight is to provide an outlook. And in planning sessions, you may have heard of the idea of maybe getting an outlook a little bit earlier on in the year rather than waiting for GSNs. And so this you can see is perhaps a glimpse at the kind of approach we're trying to sort of evolve towards, where we're giving you a bit of a look early on at what we see, at least based on the best available information. Of course, you know, everyone knows that much of our revenue and certainly much of our expense is driven by enrollment. And as you all know this year from presentations dating back to October, between the passage of budget in July of last year and our opening of school in September 2020, we had a rather dramatic drop in enrollment, over 500 students, in fact. And fortunately, what happened this year is that ordinarily that would represent a big drop in funding. But the government came in and said, no, don't worry about losing funding. We'll hold your funding steady for you, even though normally we would reduce your funding if your enrollment dropped by that much. Next year, the signals are that we can't count on that. So our early planning has been based on sustained lower enrollment. So not another huge drop, but not going back up to the pre-COVID levels at this stage of the game. Again, trying to be conservative. As Trustee Barry pointed out earlier, GSNs have not been announced yet, but the pre-GSN guidance would suggest that the funding for 21-22, a few typos here, 21-22 will be largely stable. So next year we see funding being relatively stable compared to this year. With the exception, though, of one-time related COVID funding supports provided by the provincial and federal governments, are not anticipated to be renewed, including that enrollment stabilization funding. So you saw earlier that on our previous presentation that somewhere in the neighborhood of 22, if you don't count capital, $22.5 million in COVID-specific funding supports that we've received, $22.5 million in COVID-specific funding supports that we've received this year, plus another $7 million in enrollment stabilization funding, was all intended as a one-time support to get us through that year. And as it stands right now, we're not anticipating that to be renewed. It's possible it may change, but not anticipating at this time. We're also anticipating our expenses to be stable, with the exception of significant ongoing uncertainty about the implications of the COVID pandemic. So we have, by and large, settled collective agreements, at least centrally, that drive our expenses to a large extent. Those are settled. We know what they look like, and so our expenses largely are going to be stable. Based on this, then, overall, and I'm giving you the last page of the novel here, but based on this, the finance team is suggesting that our 21-22 revenues will be approximately $371.8 million. Our expenses approximately $371.2 million, and that would result in a preliminary projected surplus for the year 21-22 of $0.6 million. So again, that's the year 21-22, has nothing to do with 2021, looking further out. So just a brief overview, again, to put the UCDSB in the context of the broader Ontario education space. So in Ontario, we have about 2.3 million students total. Upper Canada, about 26,600 ADE, about 1.3% of the provincial total. About 72 boards of education, 4,400 schools. We have 83 schools. The GSN specifically, not including PPFs and COVID-related supports and a few other categories of revenue, represents a total of $25.3 billion. And our budget, strictly GSN, would be about $352.7 million. So strictly GSN, not all those other sources, representing about 1.4% of the provincial total. And so when you, oftentimes what you'll see happen with staff is that when we get allocated an amount of funding, or the government announces a province-wide amount of funding that they're going to put towards a particular subject, we oftentimes will be doing a calculation in our heads about what is 1.4% of that, because that's roughly what our share would be, right? That's kind of how we determine whether we're doing well or falling a bit behind. Trustees have seen this slide, of course. This is just to kind of reset you on, we don't know what the distribution of revenue is going to be for the next school year, 21-22, but we do know what it is for this year. And this year we had budgeted operating revenue of $382 million, and 90% of that comes from ministry grant allocation. So just, you've seen this before, but just to give you a sense of, no surprise, the vast majority of our funding comes from the Ministry of Education, with a few other sources thrown in there. On the expense side of things, we have $377 million roughly in expenses for 2020-21. And the distribution of that, again, 73% related to instruction. So that's people in schools or people who support schools directly and instruction directly. So principals, vice principals, and so on. Again, administration and governance, which represents trustees, superintendents, many central office staff, represents about 2% of our total budget. Transportation, around 9%, is a big component of our overall operating expenses. Pupil accommodation, which really refers to facilities operations, so the heating, lighting, maintenance of school buildings, not including capital construction and so on, but really just snow plowing, grass cutting, all the things that keep schools operating on a day-to-day basis as a physical plant. About 9%, another big number. Some small other non-operating expenses, amortization expense, which is really associated with expensing capital projects on and on over their life cycle, and then school-generated funds, and these would be distinct from school budgets, but this would be expenditures that are really of funds that have been raised by school councils and so on for priorities at the local school. Trustees may also note that, flipping back to the previous slide, where we had $382 million in revenue in 2020-21, but here we only have $377 million in expenses, you might expect to see a $5 million surplus. And the fact is that that's not the case, but that additional $5 million is revenue that's provided to us for specific purposes and is deemed to be externally appropriated. So largely, as trustees will have heard and will hear again, for example, over the course of the last several years, we've had to annually fund a future retirement gratuity liability. And a big chunk of that $5 million is that annual expense associated with funding that liability, and that's not available for compliance, so that is not counted. As a result, you'll remember that on July 15th, in our original budget that trustees passed, it was about a $200,000 surplus for the year, which really represents the operating surplus available for compliance. So moving on to the next slide then, this is one we all know by heart by now. As I always say, throughout the course of a given year, we're working on 3 fiscal years. So the blue bar at the top represents the things we're doing to monitor and adjust for the current year. My previous presentation on the COVID-related funding supports was really in that blue bar. It was really all about what is happening in this year and monitoring and controlling the financials for this year. We're, as you know, done the middle bar. So we've long ago in December reported on results for the previous year, or at least it seems like a long time ago. But back in December, we presented audited financial statements for the 19-20 fiscal year. And now here we are in this presentation in the red bar, getting started on planning for next year. And as trustees also know, the staff across the board and in our schools are already in the throes of planning for next year in the course of providing staffing or planning their staffing in their school organizations for the upcoming year. And we're, of course, tonight is a first step in getting us ready to plan and pass a budget. So the 21-22 outlook, I'm very pleased that I finally got this title slide correct and referring to the correct year. So again, looking at what do we see for next year? So some of the assumptions. So here we are on slide 8. The slide is assumptions. The projected 21-22 GSN revenue, we've really basically taken the 2020-21 grant structure and funding benchmarks and more or less held them steady for next year, incrementing things that we know, for example, increments that would occur because of collective agreements and so on. But, you know, largely based on 2021, and we feel that's a reasonable assumption because some of the early guidance and signals we've received from the ministry would suggest that it's going to be largely stable. STEO, Student Transportation of Eastern Ontario, our student transportation provider, has already approved the 21-22 budget, and this incorporates figures associated with that 21-22 budget. So they're moving forward, and that's been incorporated. Again, with regard to expenses as distinct from revenue, we've very much maintained the 2020-21 expense structure. The only changes that we made are updated classroom staff affordability. So, you know, as I said earlier, you'll see this in a subsequent slide, compared to our original budget that we passed for 2020-21 back in July of 2020. Our enrollment for the upcoming year is projected to be quite a bit lower. It's not going to drop more than it has already, but will largely be held steady. And so that has an impact on both funding and the expense side of things, that we have fewer students, and therefore collective agreements would demand that we staff fewer teachers, just as if we had more students, we would staff more teachers. We update school budget expenses, and we also update school operations budget expenses. So there's a number of, you know, if we have, for example, anticipate benchmark increases in utility costs, for example, that would be reflected as well. As part of our assumptions, we've included no incremental COVID-19 related funding supports. So as you saw in my previous presentation, about $22.5 million specifically that have been provided by the province for the one-time COVID response in 2020-21. We've always understood that's a one-time response, and so we're not anticipating as yet that some or all of that would be provided in the 21-22 school year. The good news, though, is that we're also anticipating the removal of the majority of expenses. So if we don't have COVID-related expenses, then obviously we wouldn't need the revenue associated with it. However, we also do recognize that there's a fair amount of uncertainty remaining about what the sort of tail end, hopefully, of COVID is going to look like in terms of our ongoing requirements or our needs around things like sick leave, replacement costs, PPE, signage, and those kinds of things. So we feel it's responsible for us to include a contingency reserve that will allow us to respond to that until it becomes clear what the response is and whether there will be any alternative funding supports provided. So moving on to slide 9, then the title of this slide is Enrollment Projection for 21-22. Again, I think the real the rows I think to pay attention to initially here would be our 2020-21 original budget. As you can see, back on July 15th of 2020, our original budget had a total board enrollment of 26,653 students. That was driving both our revenue and our expenses. By the time we got to financial forecast number 1, which was admittedly in January, but we had known about this trend since the October timeframe, we were down about 600 students. Since that time, more or less, it's held steady. So as I reported at financial forecast number 2, 25,948, and we're anticipating that, again, holding what we would consider to be largely steady. So planning our initial enrollments for the upcoming year at 25,870. So not again as precipitous a drop as we saw between the original budget and the start of the school year this year, but we're planning conservatively because we don't, early signals have been that stabilization funding that we received this year to the tune of $7 million to offset that funding loss would not be coming in the upcoming year. So that really represents, I think, a very conservative stance for us going into the year. The good news is that if more students show up, we get funded for more students, and we can then staff up to support more students as the funding flows in. The challenge that we always face is that if we plan early for more students, it's very difficult, if not impossible in some cases, we lose the funding, but it's really impossible for us to reverse the expenses. So that puts us in a tricky spot. So moving on from the enrollment projections then, this is just a very highly summarized slide of how we see things shaking out with all those assumptions that we spoke about. So the original budget that you saw for this current year that we passed on, or trustees passed on July 15th, 2020, we had total revenue for compliance of $376.2 million and total expenses for compliance of $376 million, leaving us with a $200,000 or $0.2 million surplus available for compliance. And as Trustee Barry correctly pointed out earlier, our most recent financial forecast number 2 for this year, for how we're going to end this current fiscal year, is right now at about a $1.1 million deficit. But 21-22 is a new year and we start fresh. So based on the assumptions that we've laid out, our initial budget outlook is total revenue of $371.8 million and total expenses for compliance of $371.2 million. That would leave us, if all things come to fruition, a budget surplus in the 2020-22 school year of $600,000. So a $400,000 improvement in our year-end surplus. So moving on then to the next slide, slide 11. So what are the main contributors to that budget, the difference between the 2020-21 original budget and the 21-22 budget outlook where we are tonight? So why is it that our revenue dropped and our expenses dropped? Well, the first thing, of course, is enrollment-driven funding. So compared to, as I mentioned earlier, over 600 fewer students anticipated compared to the budget that was passed on July 15th. That represents a reduction in $6.9 million in funding year over year compared to the original budget for 2020-21. Good news is SIP revenue. So in our original budget for 2020-21, you'll recall that at that stage of the game, we still weren't sure whether all those $3.1 million in SIP applications were going to come through. So we were conservative, and we said we're only going to budget for about $750,000 until we know, whether we're successful. Turns out that we were successful, and so we're now comfortable budgeting an additional $2.3 million compared to the original 2021 budget. So $2.3 million in additional revenue for SIP that we're comfortable counting on. The second thing here, I think, is that net change in row 3 here, net change in regular GSN and tuition fee funded budgets. And one of the things we want to emphasize is that, when we have fewer students, of course we have less funding, but we also have less expense because we don't have to provide instructional services and supports to those students. Now, the challenge is that sometimes the expense doesn't decrease as fast as the funding does, but the good news is that there's a decrease in the expense of $3.8 million overall. In row 4, what you see here is that we've essentially booked $2.2 million. So this represents an increase in what we anticipate as expenses related to COVID compared to our original budget in 2020-21. So this really represents, you can think of this as a $2.2 million contingency reserve to account for higher than normal expenses due to ongoing COVID related response. And by way of example, one of the things that I think we could consider is that if, for example, everyone's vaccinated and we go back to school, it's quite possible that you may see when people have symptoms of a cold or some sort of sickness, they may be more encouraged, if you will, to take sick time and also stay home longer until those symptoms subside. And both of those factors would lead to increased sick leave replacement costs. And so we've actually tried to factor that in here, and that represents about half, I think, of this amount, with some other amounts in there to cover things like ongoing limited PPE purchase requirements, and other factors that may be like cleaning and so on that we would want to factor in. As I mentioned earlier, trustees know that over the course of the last 10 years or so, we've had to annually provide or annually book an expense to cover a liability associated with future retirement benefits. So the idea of a retirement gratuity. We've had to actually have some put money aside or have an expense in our budget to cover that liability to the tune of $3.9 million, and that is going to be done at the end of 2021. So this really represents a decreased expense or available funding, if you will, to the tune of $3.9 million. So a favorable improvement. And then with regard to the Kemptville Apprenticeship Project that you heard about this evening, an exciting opportunity, and you've heard reported on before, about $500,000 in operational expenses to support that project. So this really represents the $400,000 difference that you see in the anticipated year-ending surplus between the 2021 budget, original budget, and this initial budget outlook. So 2020-21 budget, we had passed a $200,000 surplus. This early outlook anticipates a $600,000 surplus for 2021, the difference being $400,000, and this is what accounts for that $400,000 difference between the 2 years. Moving on to slide 12, as trustees know, we have two kinds of surpluses. We have an in-year sort of operational surplus, and once the year is done, whatever surplus or deficit we have at the end of the year for that year it gets added to our accumulated surplus for the board, which is the sum total of all the in-year surpluses up to that point. And so, yeah, you'll recall that again, at the start of, or at the end of 2019-20, we ended with a $6.9 million in-year surplus. That got added to our previous accumulated surplus of $4.2 million, leaving us at the start of this year with an accumulated surplus of $11.1 million. Our current financial forecast, or our most recent financial forecast, predicts a deficit of $1.1 million for the 2020-21 school year, or this school year. If that comes to fruition, that will get added, or subtracted, I should say, off of our $11.1 million accumulated surplus, leaving us with a $10 million accumulated surplus at the end of this fiscal year. And if we go into the 21-22 school year, and as we've sort of initially laid out in our look into the crystal ball this evening, we end the year with a $600,000 surplus. That will get added to the $10 million accumulated surplus, leaving us with $10.6 million at the end of 21-22. Of course, it's early days, and an awful lot can happen in between now and then, as we know, having just lived through the last year. But that really, we just wanted to show trustees mechanically about what the effect would be on the accumulated surplus based on some of the information that we've presented recently. A little bit about the proposed budget timeline. So how do we get from here to a budget? And of course, this is at the discretion of the trustees, but staff always feel it's helpful if we can think about the nature of how we get there. Tonight, of course, the budget outlook. We're hoping that by Friday at 4:30, we'll get the GSNs. So staff will get immediately to work on looking at what the GSN says and whether that will have a material effect on any of the things that we've predicted this evening or thought about this evening. We would anticipate by May 26th, we could present a preliminary board budget with greater detail. On May 12th, of course, sorry, backing up, we would, try to provide a bit of a characterization of what we see in the GSN. So probably less numerical or less quantitative and more qualitative at that point. But the quantitative part would come on May 26th, where we would be able to present a preliminary budget. Of course, we would involve SEAC. And then we would, I think, be prepared to bring back, hopefully based on the feedback of the board, a proposed budget on June 2nd, and ideally getting to approval on the June 16th timeframe, with giving staff a couple of weeks to get this into the ministry for the June 30th deadline, which is a fairly involved task. So in summary, slide 14. Based on guidance to date, funding for 21-22 is largely anticipated to be a return to normal. No expectation of further one-time COVID support at this time. We really do think there's considerable uncertainty about the extent to which enrollment will bounce back, but we feel that being conservative with enrollment is better than overshooting and not being able to back out of expenses when we lose funding. So the idea here is that if enrollment goes up, the funding goes up, and we can staff up accordingly, but it's harder to go the opposite way. The baseline forecast for 21-22 estimates a $600,000 in-year operating surplus based on the prevailing assumptions. And again, once we receive the GSN and technical paper, we'll be able to give you a more detailed and more refined revenue expense calculation. And that represents everything for this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Superintendent Hobbs. I'm opening the floor to questions.
Hi, I had my name there for a question.
Yes, go ahead, Trustee Swan.
Hi, through you, Chair. Okay, we have the one-time COVID funding, and I know some of it was for ventilation in our schools. How much of an effort, and this is bouncing off what Trustee McCrae said, how much have we done in our schools to improve the ventilation in our classrooms and our portables? How much do we have left? And is this accounted for what we have left to do in this budget? Have we budgeted to make sure our schools are as safe as possible if we have to return to school in September? Thank you.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I'm not really prepared this evening to offer a full presentation on what we've done with regard to ventilation. I can assure trustees that the actual one-time funding that's been devoted towards improving ventilation has been spent in its entirety. I know that, for example, in terms of the operating funding that's been provided, we've put approximately 1,300 portable HEPA filtration units in school classrooms. The federal infrastructure funding is virtually entirely mobilized and will be, as per the requirements of the federal program, will be completely spent and operationalized in schools by the December 31st deadline. And then on top of that, there's a whole series of other initiatives that we're putting in place as part of our normal capital operating program to do what we've been doing for the last 15 years, which is working on improving the HVAC systems in our schools. And finally, on top of that, I think I may have presented in the fall a little bit about what the actual regime my staff have taken on from an operational standpoint with regard to improving air handling in schools, making sure that humidity levels are conducive or not conducive to the transmission of the pathogens. They've been changing filters on a even more regular basis, making sure that if there aren't opportunities for the air handling system doesn't actually accommodate the fresh air requirements that we want, that we're getting windows open and so on. So there's a whole host of things that we're doing. We're very confident that not only is the money spent, but we're going quite a bit beyond, I think, what the bare minimum requirements are. And certainly within the bounds of our normal capital. But that's, if the trustee requires more than that, I'd be certainly happy to bring a facilities report back to speak to that.
Sorry, I would really like to see this because we want our students as safe as possible, and air quality in classrooms and enclosed spaces has been brought up now because of how the virus is now deemed to be spreading. So I think this is utmost importance. And even if we have to, I mean, we had a $10 million surplus. I think if we have to dig into this to make our schools as safe as possible, as fast as possible, I think this should be a priority. Thank you.
Trustee Swan, I would like to just point out that that is a priority and that any money that we have received has been spent exactly for those purposes.
No, thank you very much. I'm saying to use our surplus to make sure we can get it done faster and better, because all our schools should be equal in having the opportunity to having really good air quality in the schools and good HEPA filters, etc. Thank
you. Trustee Parisier?
Yes, thank you. Through you, Chair, I just sort of had a comment. I know a couple of trustees have come back and forth regarding the air quality in our schools, and potentially Superintendent Hobbs could highlight that I believe all of our schools have been tested and meet the air regulations that are set forth. And before we jump to any itemization or spending regarding air quality, I would want to make sure that the experts go out there and actually indicate if we need something different in our schools than we currently have. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any further questions?
I had a quick question, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Trustee McDonald.
I don't know where the slide was, but when you were talking about the changes, and we would end up with the 600,000 or 0.6 million, you indicated the Kemptville project was $500,000. Is it possible to get a more detailed report on the project and the cost associated to the project at a future meeting?
The answer to that is yes.
Okay.
Are there any further questions?
Mr. Chair, John McCrae again, if I may.
I believe Trustee Swan was first, and then you're next, John.
Sorry, I have a question on slide number 5, I think it was. It said 9% of our costs are transportation, which is fair. I'm just wondering how we're faring with transportation due to the fact our kids aren't going to school haven't been going to school for the majority of this year. I know we have obligations, but I'm just wondering if you could explain that a bit further, or if we're up on the 9% or down on the 9%, or how that works. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, would you like me to take a run at that?
Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a great question, Trustee Swan. There's a couple of ways that we look at transportation. So certainly the vast majority of what we spend on transportation more or less gets, for lack of a better term, handed over to STIO because they're our transportation service provider. I think, what we're seeing that we obviously anticipate ending this year in a surplus scenario with regard to STIO. And, how big that is remains to be seen based on, I think, a couple of factors, which is, how long the continued lockdown lasts. There's, as you know, one of the costs that we incurred during the January lockdown was continuing to provide transportation for special education students. So that's a cost that continues to occur. And there's also, it's not 100% savings when we're not providing transportation, because we still, I think, do have real concerns, and our bus operators do have real concerns about driver retention. So we're still actually paying them some for to be on standby, if you will. So what the most recent forecast that I saw for STIO specifically would be that we're going to be in a fairly healthy surplus scenario by the end of the year, which of course the board benefits from directly. The second piece of the transportation part is the transportation that we might provide on behalf of students directly for things like field trips or whatever that happens to be, directly by schools. And that's not occurring either, of course. So that would be a potentially part of a surplus that you would see as well. So I think the thing that we're mindful of whenever we look at a potential surplus in any area at the school is that number one is the volatility of the situation over the course of the past year. Things change quickly, and with it, expenses and revenues. And the second part is we're not quite sure how the ministry might, choose to handle surpluses that we may incur at the end of the year. Whether they sort of, if we need to actually cover more expenses in the next year, whether they say, hey, we're not going to provide you more funding, just use your surplus from the previous year to cover it. Or they're going to provide us additional funding. So short answer is we're expecting a surplus, all things being equal. We're just cautious about how to employ it or use it with the sort of uncertainty in the future that remains.
Thank you.
Trustee McRae.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would ask Superintendent Hobbs how we're doing in regard to water bottle filling stations in most, if not all, schools.
Trustee McRae, I think you asked this question at a previous meeting, and I knew we had plans in place to do it. I just couldn't say anything about it at the time, but I was dying to answer your question for you. Right now, we're in the process of, we've sourced about 350 water bottle filling stations for our schools, and are starting to work as we speak on the plans for rolling those out and replacing water fountains with them this summer. I don't have off the top of my head a count of what percentage of our water fountains that will replace in the first round, but it'll replace a healthy proportion and certainly make them more than accessible to students in all of our schools. And we'll continue to supplement that amount, which is being funded by the Federal Infrastructure Resiliency Stream, with our own renewal. So that's something we are doing already. This will just happen an awful lot faster.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Are there any further questions? Hearing none.
Sorry, I have one last question.
Go ahead, Trustee Swan.
We were talking about staff taking time off because they have to be isolated and the costs associated with it. Do you foresee some sort of savings there with the provincial announcement today that the first 3 days goes through WSIB apparently? Thank you.
Trustee Swan, I wouldn't venture to say based on I just had occasion to read a brief newspaper article about that particular thing today. My initial reaction would be I wouldn't necessarily anticipate it, especially if there was I think some concrete reasons that had to do with getting a vaccination or getting a test or something like that, and it was represented 3 days. And what we're seeing is that we're already considerably above the 3 days to start on average, and that's just by virtue of the fact that it's our sector, very similar in the hospital sector, by the way. So I wouldn't venture to say that we would or plan on savings. I think it would be still prudent to plan on an increased expense there.
Thank you.
Hearing no further questions, I'm going to move to 1404, which is the appointment of the acting secretary to the board. And I believe, Director Sliwa, would you like to introduce this and comment on it?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, this evening's report is a summation of your consultation with your board's legal counsel about how to proceed, what's within the purview of the board to provide a presence for supporting the governance function of the board and the preparation of meetings of the board through the office of the secretary of the board. And in lieu of my absence over the next few weeks, brought to you into the vice chair with some different suggestions. This was the final recommendation brought to you and for consideration by the board this evening. So, Mr. Chair, I'll turn that back over to you to see if you wanted to pursue that further.
And we do, but subject to any questions or comments from trustees? Hearing none, I have a motion moved by Trustee Schooler, seconded by Trustee Swan, that the Upper Canada District School Board appoint Roger Richard as acting secretary of the board for the period of April 29, 21 to June 30th, 2021. Any further discussion? Hearing none, I would ask that you cast your ballots, please. I'm not sure I'm there, but I'm voting in favor.
Mr. Chair, I'm not getting the voting material. I vote in favor. Thank you.
Okay. Chair McAllister, that motion carries.
Thank you very much, Ms. Workman. So I believe that ends our meeting as such. So I have a motion moved by Trustee Parisien, seconded by Trustee McDonald, that the Upper Canada District School Board move into committee of the whole April 28, 2021. Would you please cast your ballots, please? I'm in favor.
Chair McAllister, that motion carries.
Thank you. I have motion number 2, which is moved by Trustee McCray, seconded by Trustee McPherson or Vice Chair McPherson, that committee of the whole move into private session April 28th, 2021. Please cast your ballots. I'm in favor.
Thank you. Chair McAllister, that motion carries.
Thank you. It's 9:13, ladies and gentlemen. I'm wondering if we could take maybe a 2-minute break to and come back into private session. Thank you. They'll be on the line. Lisa, do the trustees have to sign